The first thing that I want to talk about is basically why we should be doing public engagement. So why should we be interested in this whole sphere, this whole endeavour at all? And there are various reasons for doing it at various different levels. There are social reasons, so these are very broad reasons. These are kind of very general philosophical reasons why we might think that engaging with the general public, whatever that is and how many publics it really involves, might be a good thing. So first of all, I think that there's a really significant moral obligation to do this. Any of us that are doing research in universities are largely publicly funded to do that. And so that brings with it an obligation to communicate with the people who are funding us to do what we do as a job. If we look at science engagement in particular, then we're obviously talking about a really important sector of our economy, and the government has just realised that. So even in a time of austerity, we've got a commitment to science funding now of 600 million in the budget, which is fantastic, and I think it underpins the fact that science is so important to our potential for growth in our economy. So of course we want to recruit people into this area, and in order to raise awareness, to raise aspirations, we've got to get out there into the community and do that. There's a very general philosophical reason why we should be doing it too. If we frame ourselves as a democracy, that means that we assume that we have the tools in order to be able to make decisions. And I know that we elect people to make those decisions for us. Now, we perhaps want those people to be as scientifically literate as possible, because at the end of the day, the people in government, but also us as individuals, we're going to make better decisions if we're better able to assess the evidence in front of us. And so a certain amount of scientific literacy is absolutely essential for that. There has also been a terrible downturn in trust in science and scientists, which seemed to be something that happened in the latter part of the 20th century. And however many reasons you can think of for that, we're left with this situation where there's often an element of distrust in both science as an endeavour and in scientists themselves. And we can start to break that down by being a lot more open about what we do. There's another very wide social philosophical reason for science engagement, and that's to bring it back into our culture. It seems to have been hived off into this weird little ghetto, and we see that all the time in the way it's shown in the media. We hardly ever have a scientist on the Question Time panel, for instance. So something where we're discussing political issues, social issues, where the scientific evidence is often going to be incredibly important to decision making, and there's this complete lack of a scientific voice. And we see that in the media, but I think we see that more generally in society as well. So somehow we need to rescue science from its position of being in a ghetto, which is, again, I think something peculiar that happened in the 20th century, and push it back into culture again. There are institutional reasons for doing this. So as a university, it's going to be incredibly important to undertake public engagement in order to secure funding. And I think we all know that only too well. That moral obligation that I mentioned is now more than a moral obligation. It's a very definite obligation which is written into grants, it's written into the RAF as well. We won't recruit the best students and staff unless we are engaging with the wider community and talking about science. There are other reasons as well, so past graduates, okay, while our graduates are here, we hope that they're engaging with the science and the programmes that they are involved with, but when they leave us, we hope that we can continue to update them on scientific developments. And sometimes that might be professions where those people have gone on to be scientists themselves, but it might be lots of other things as well. It could be surgeons, it could be teachers, lots of different sectors of society where they need to be keeping up with the latest ideas and the latest research. Increasing the impact of research, and obviously that is relevant to the REF and to grants as well, but just thinking about how the discoveries we make actually have an impact in wider society. If we don't make any effort to engage with society at large, then we're going to minimise the impacts that they could possibly have. And quite importantly, I think, informing the direction of research. So actually making this a two-way process, making it about communication rather than just a passing over of information from universities to the wider community. Getting an idea of what is important from the perspective of people outside of our disciplines. And transforming the ivory tower, where we're all sort of shut away and getting on with our own things behind closed lab doors as well, into an engaged university. This all sounds very dry and philosophical at the moment, and not terribly inspiring. I think it gets more inspiring when you think about the personal reasons for doing it, although perhaps the first few points aren't quite so inspiring. I think we all realise that, again, as institutions, but also as members of staff in institutions, that we're going to have to do this to a certain extent to secure funding, and that it's now part of our job descriptions, as it were. Increasing the impact of research, I think personally most of us would want to do that. Also putting research into context. I think sometimes we concentrate on such narrow areas of research, it can be quite difficult to stand back. And any sort of public engagement activities that you do are really useful in terms of contextualising what you're doing, and really sort of coming at it again fresh. I think we kind of get a bit stale and perhaps into a rut sometimes when we're not contextualising our research. As well as updating the professionals who are out there, it's quite important for us in universities to keep abreast of what's going on in professional practice. And I've certainly found that in my own career. So teaching clinical anatomy to medical students, it's been incredibly important for me to carry on that contact with clinicians, so I know how the anatomy is going to be translated into an application when the medical students emerge from the other end of that long training and become doctors. But there are many, many examples that you could think of where actually it's very useful for you as a teacher and a researcher in the university to be keeping in contact with graduates out there in the real world. And then, apart from all those kind of slightly kind of moralising and financial reasons, there's a fantastic joy here. So I think most of the people I speak to, if not all the people I speak to, who undertake some forms of public engagement, find that they talk about fulfilment, they talk about satisfaction, and they rediscover a sense of excitement, often about their own subject as well. So it might be something that we feel thoroughly obliged to do, but hopefully it could be something that actually is a worthwhile and fulfilling and exciting part of our jobs as well. A little bit more about the science ghetto, because I do feel quite strongly about this. In 1959, C.P. Snow gave his Reed lecture about the two cultures, and he spoke about this separation between science and art in our culture, and he spoke about the way that people were polarised between either being literary intellectuals or being scientists, and never the twain shall meet kind of thing. And he lamented this because he said there are problems on both sides and problems for society as a whole that come from that. If you're somebody who has self-identified themselves as an artist and you've totally eschewed any kind of scientific element to your life, I suppose, then you're cutting yourself off from the best tool we have to assess evidence. And if you think about all of the big issues that are facing our society at the moment, from climate change to where we get our energy from, all of those sort of things, how can you honestly make decisions about those or even engage in meaningful debate unless you've got some kind of science literacy there as well? So there's a problem if you go off to the artistic side and completely forget about science. And on the science side, you're separating yourself off from the rest of society. You're kind of willingly doing that and losing part of yourself. I think that we mostly start off enjoying both art and science. If you think back to primary school, I don't think there's many of us that would have hated either set of subjects at primary school. And there seems to be something that goes on in secondary education which encourages us to polarise ourselves, to think of ourselves and to frame ourselves and our identity in this way, so that we're either an artist or a scientist. It does seem to be something which is quite peculiar to British education. So it doesn't seem to be quite as prominent on the continent, for instance, where students are often studying a larger range of subjects right up until school leaving. Whereas I think we narrow down incredibly with A-levels, and perhaps things like the International Baccalaureate give us an example of how we actually might increase the range of subjects that our younger students are studying up until school leaving age. I'm just going to refer to a couple of great thinkers on the subject if we think about why science is important and why we should care about scientific literacy as a society. So this is TaOxley, and he said science is simply common sense at its best. He doesn't mean common sense in terms of it is a way of thinking or a body of knowledge that we all have in common, because it's obviously not. We have to use very special tools to tap into it, but nevertheless the way of thinking is really an extension of our natural faculty of looking at the world around us and drawing lessons from evidence and experience. And then going back even further in time, there are in fact two things: science and opinion. The former begets knowledge, the latter ignorance, which I think is fantastic, and that goes all the way back to Hippocrates. So thinking about some of the challenges then, so hopefully, I imagine that most of you are here because you think public engagement is a worthwhile thing. So probably having just spent half of this talk saying why it's worthwhile, will have kind of washed over and you feel all lovely and warm and think, well, yes, it is a worthwhile thing. But what are the challenges we face? Well, I was thinking about this a few weeks ago, and so I decided to put a question out there. One of the best ways I've got of putting questions out there is to tweet them. So I tweeted, I'm interested in this. What turns people off science? I was more interested in the obverse rather than saying, okay, what turned you on to science? I was more interested in what turns people off science, because I thought I might get comments back from both scientists and non-scientists, and I did. In fact, I was absolutely inundated for about 48 hours with this barrage of replies, which were quite shocking, really. And I collated them all, and I looked at them and I thought there are some really big themes coming out of this. And rather disappointingly, one of the big themes was this. I would have said probably a third of the responses I had said bad teaching, which is quite shocking. It's quite shocking if you're a teacher in the sciences. It's quite shocking if you're interested in science communication. People said things like uninspiring teaching, unenthusiastic teachers. I think it can be taught in a very obscure way. No grandeur. What a shame. What a shame that somebody's come away from science education thinking it's lacking grandeur, that science is lacking grandeur. Teachers who teach without a passion and have lost interest themselves and being taught to remember things rather than discover them. It's quite, kind of makes you want to just go and curl up in a corner. On the one hand, it does make you want to curl up in a corner, and on the other hand, I think for me, what I take away from that is we really need to cherish our teachers. We really need to cherish good teachers, and that means in both universities and in schools as well. So those people who have passion, who are inspiring, we need to look after them. And within universities, we need to do what we can to support schools and to keep that passion alive. So this idea, again, of updating past graduates, professionals working out there, bring teachers back into universities, get them to re-engage with the excitement of scientific discovery so that they can pass that on to their pupils rather than just passing on a dry list of facts to remember. Other answers, or other replies, it sounds like a test, doesn't it? This is an exam I set the general public. Other replies talked about a lack of relevance to everyday life, which is quite stunning, really, when you think about it. So scientists themselves, or scientists of the community, are perceived as insular, elitist and brainist to normal people. So this kind of very strong idea about elitism. The perception that science is of no relevance in day-to-day life, which is, I think, utterly shocking. And quite often, I think, when we're confronted with that as scientists, we'll roll out things like, oh, well, look at your mobile phone. You don't have to look at complicated bits of technology like that, you have to look at the impact of science on your own life. The fact that longevity has massively increased over the 20th century, and that is down to science and technology. And that, I think, is a much more impressive and tangible thing than a mobile phone. You know, you could lose that mobile phone, I don't really care about it. But these really sort of important impacts that science has and technology has on our length and our quality of life, I think, are incredibly important. Again, something that C.P. Snow was talking about in his Reed lecture. People feel science is only relevant if it has some direct benefit through invention or discovery. And that, I think, is a difficult one because although, of course, we want to promote the direct benefits that science has, there's also areas of science that don't have any immediate direct benefits either. And we'll all be familiar with discussions at the moment about areas of science that are attracting funding because they're going to be seen to have some impact, there's going to be some predictable impact. It was 18 years between the development of the technology for IVF and the first test tube baby. So that's 18 years between the invention of something and the actual impact of it in terms of benefits on people's lives. Yeah, this is great. Having a government that seems to regularly ignore scientific advice doesn't help, I'm sure. And we've seen far too many examples of that over the past few years, from examples with the last government and the loss of David Nutt from the Independent Drugs Committee, what Ben Goldacre called the Nutsack affair, which I think was perhaps a big PR blunder for the government. I don't think it did anything in terms of public distrust in science. I mean, I think it showed quite clearly that the scientists were trying to be impartial and independent and were not going to be manoeuvred into this position where they were simply supporting already existing policies. Really important that our politicians engage with science early, that they use scientific evidence to build their policies, rather than just to marshal some evidence which they think might help authenticate it or lend it an air of authority later. This is quite interesting. Too much research in dubious or contentious fields, making people live longer or cloning. And I think that's a breakdown in communication, because I think if you say to someone, we're going to make some people live forever, then people might think, no, this is, why are scientists doing this? We're designed to live a certain length of time. I don't want to live for 500 years. Why are we paying people to work on this problem? And it's about making it relevant. So rather than saying we're looking at immortality, or we're looking at lengthening people's lives so they live longer than they ever had before, it's about making it very personal and saying, how would you like to spend 10 more years, 20 more years with your grandchildren? So it's that kind of personal relevance and making it something which is relevant to people in their kind of everyday lives, rather than something that seems very distant. Accessibility was a big one, and I'm really lucky in some ways because the area of science that I work in, although of course every area of science depends on mathematics heavily, the area of science that I'm in is not astrophysics. And I think if you're in those kind of areas where you're hard sciences and you're basically working entirely in the language of mathematics, it is a difficult one. So physics and equations, the complicated maths that seems to be required. And again, are we looking at a deficit here in our earlier education? Are people scared of maths because of the way that they've engaged with this at school? And this I thought was wonderful and quite a difficult question. Can I ever truly see the boundless beauty of knowledge without the maths to map it? So I think as science communicators, we have to think about ways of getting around that. We have to think about whether people need to have more of that language, but we also need to think about ways of translating what we're saying into more accessible languages, I suppose. Talking about just general language, so spoken language, written language, complicated language that makes it hard to understand. We all tend to fall into jargon very easily. So the jargon, the technical language that we all use can be fantastic in terms of being very precise, but at the same time it can also put people off, and we just need to be aware of that. And I think that everybody that teaches first-year undergraduates knows how to deal with that problem. Use technical language where it's necessary, because it is precise, because you don't need to say a whole sentence. Just introduce the term. don't just drop these terms into everyday language. It can be really difficult because you get so used to them. I was talking to my husband about where to position something on the mantelpiece, and I said it would look a bit better if it was slightly more lateral. And he said, what on earth are you talking about? And sorry, I'm an anatomist. Useful terms, medial and lateral. You know, it should be in everyday language. Somebody said they were put off by Phil Harding's fingernails. Quite a few people were tweeting back at me talking about things which were to do with propaganda and spin. And again, this is interesting, I think, because it might be at the root of some of that distrust in science. The fact that people are feeling as though it's being packaged in a certain way in order to push it on the general public. So the insistence that it should be zip bang fun. So the insistence that absolutely everything in science, you know, it's got to be wonderful, it's got to be exciting, it's got to involve big explosions. I think very quickly people realise that that's not what science is all about. The general standard of science reporting in the mainstream media, which does tend to concentrate on ideas of breakthroughs, it does tend to over-sensationalise things. It's very difficult to represent something, first of all to get people to read about things which are proceeding incrementally, and we're not necessarily going to have massive breakthroughs happening all the time. Occasionally we might get something which you could actually honestly describe as a breakthrough, but they're not going to be happening all the time. And getting a readership or a journalist who's appealing to a particular readership to be interested in a subject if there isn't a breakthrough, I think is quite a challenge. Glib explanations of complicated things. So people don't like being patronised, they don't like being talked down to. They know when you're trying to wrap something up in too simple a way. They know when you're dumbing down. And then there are the image problems, which are still there. The image of a scientist is someone who's geeky, which is a word I hate, nerdy, obsessive, antisocial and male, sorry for all the men in the audience, like Sheldon and his pals, stuffy, deliberately patronising and deliberately aloof from contemporary culture. There we go then, scientists who ghettoise themselves, how dreadful. One of the movements that there's been in the last few years is to reclaim the word geek and the word nerd and to make them cool, whatever that means. And I'm really suspicious about this because, first of all, it means that if you are a scientist, you have to call yourself a geek. And I think there's a lot of us who are scientists who don't consider ourselves to be geeks. And when I've talked to people about this before, I find a lot of women who really don't like that association. And the other thing is I think it just increases the idea, it just builds the walls of the ghetto higher. It might try and encourage people into the ghetto, but it very much says this is for a particular type of person. If you're a geek, you can come in. It doesn't say this is for everybody. And I don't like words like that which encourage divisions, encourage divisive attitudes, and make science even more safe in its ghetto. I applaud the kind of intent behind that reclaiming of the word geek, but I think it's a misjudgment to do it. Meeting the challenges then, what can universities do? Well, hopefully we're seeing a culture change in universities, because I think if you go back 15, 20 years ago, there were an awful lot of people in the universities who thought this was a very peripheral activity, it was an add-on, it was something that maybe academics and students could do in their spare time, at weekends, in the evenings, things like that. And it certainly wasn't part of your core work. It certainly wasn't something you could expect to do during your normal working hours. To the extent that I had to slope off to go to primary schools and give talks without telling anyone where I was going. So I think universities can make sure that public engagement is embedded in research and teaching. Also, talking about public engagement from a very early stage in training and education as well. So making sure that science communication and science engagement isn't just something that academics are talking about amongst themselves, but that we're doing it as a whole university community, and that our students are kind of aware of this this part of the role of scientists, and students are some of our best ambassadors as well from universities. This is a really difficult one. Ensuring that public engagement isn't detrimental to researchers' careers, and I think that's something that we're all kind of grappling with at the moment, because our careers, our jobs as academics involve so many different bits and pieces, and it almost feels that if there's another bit that's coming in, it's necessarily going to take away from other things that we're doing. And at the moment, there are very few places where public engagement is, for instance, included in job profiles, is included in things like annual reviews, is included in progress and promotion. And if it's going to be taken seriously, it's got to be part of those roles. It's got to be alongside teaching, admin and research. We've got to have public engagement in there as well. I think it's suffering. I think in many universities we're kind of grappling as well with the relationship between teaching and research, and the fact that if people have got a heavier teaching burden and are doing a lesser amount of research, they do still tend to be seen as second-class citizens compared with the research stars who might give a few lectures a year. We need to perhaps come up with a much more multifaceted idea of what it is to be a researcher that includes all of those different elements and allows people to be doing those different elements in different proportions, without necessarily putting them into different career paths as well. Because at some point in your career you might be concentrating on teaching more than research, at other points on research more than teaching, and we've got to get public engagement in there as well. So kind of broader, going back to kind of very broad ideas, I suppose, of what a lecturer is. As scientists, and these are just kind of ideas that I've kind of put together really, but in terms of what we can do ourselves as communicators and to try to engage effectively, I think a lot of it comes down to effective communication, and we've talked about some of those things tangentially, but things like making sure that you are just keeping a check on yourself, standing back every now and then and making sure that you're not using too much jargon. So using accessible language, but it's this balance. So using accessible language but not dumbing down, not patronising people, not reducing things to such simple ideas that actually they lose any touch of the complex concepts that you're trying to get over. And again, anyone who teaches undergraduates is familiar with this challenge, because if you try to get across a complex subject, you have to break it down into bite-sized accessible pieces. But if you take too many of those pieces away, you suddenly lost the concept that you were getting to begin with. So I think it's a familiar challenge. It's just doing it for an even broader audience than first-year undergraduates. Learning to use a narrative, and this is something that I've really appreciated in terms of my working with broadcast media, and I think probably to begin with was a bit resistant to, and then I realised the power of storytelling, and I think again it's something which has really helped my teaching. So there's also this idea that if you're doing public engagement activities, that you bring something from that. It can change your way of thinking about your research, but it can also give you transferable skills which you then take back into teaching as well. And I think the use of narrative is a really, really important skill. As lecturers, we tend to have people sitting there as a captive audience. You're not going to walk out, are you? As a captive audience, and I think the tendency is to go, right, here's the content I need to get over, here are the bullet points. Just forget about that. Think about the content and think about how you can tell a story that actually means that those students are going to walk out of the room, or the people that you're communicating with in terms of public engagement, they're going to walk away with a much fuller understanding, a richer understanding, rather than just having picked up on a couple of bullet points. This is a difficult one. Balancing all with relevance, it's quite an important thing to do. You want to let people into some of that wonder that science, presumably as a scientist, has elicited in you. So you want to get over some of that sense of excitement and wonder, but at the same time not to over-egg it, and at the same time to make sure that it's personally relevant. Otherwise it's just a big, awesome and slightly scary thing. So we need to kind of balance those two elements in order to be effective communicators. And of course, communication means coming together. So it's a two-way process. We shouldn't just be looking at disseminating information. We should be open to ideas coming back at us as well. We need to use the media effectively and honestly. And we have all sorts of new media that are appearing now, which are really wonderful. We're seeing a fantastic expansion of our print media. We're seeing a really wonderful expansion of things like open source publishing, which is amazing in terms of spreading ideas and opening up ideas. It's throwing open the doors of the libraries. In terms of broadcast media, there's a healthy amount of science on various broadcast media, including the BBC. So we've got about 4 million people tuning in every week to watch something to do with science on the BBC at the moment. And over the course of a year, at least half of the UK population will watch some science on television. So whilst you might have reservations about dealing with broadcast media, remember that it's an incredibly effective way of reaching out to a very, very large sector of the population. And in terms of using it honestly, you have to be honest about your own science, you have to be honest about the implications of your own science, and you have to just rein it back a bit and think about whether you're over-sensationalising or just selling it a bit too much. And again, that is a balance. It's a balance between being excited about something but not pushing it too hard, because again, as we've seen from some of those Twitter responses, people lose trust if you do that as well. Avoiding being arrogant. So I think, as we saw from some of those responses, this idea that scientists are a bit elitist and are separate from society and kind of just carry on in their own direction. They do research which isn't necessarily relevant to society, and they've got their own reasons for doing things. There must be some kind of agenda why people are doing cloning. Why would they want to do that? So to get back to the reasons for why you're doing your science, to be clear about the ethical milieu that you're working in as well, and just generally to be quite humble about it. We can all promote stronger connections between universities and communities, so that's something which can go on at a kind of institutional level, but it can also go on at an individual level as well, through all the connections we have in our communities. We're people outside of the university as well as within it, and so we should foster those connections, particularly promoting stronger connections between universities and schools as well when it comes to science. And just remember that you don't have to fit into those two cultures. You don't have to go back to 1959 and be either an artist or a scientist. And in fact, people are going to warm to you more, and what you do is going to be seen as being more relevant, and communication is going to be much easier if you allow that other side of yourself to blossom as well. Thank you.